Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on a Friday for a concise news briefing, and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defence or aerospace. I'm Dominic Perry, FlightGlobal's aerospace editor in London, and today we're talking about Boeing again. Sorry, but there's a lot going on in Seattle. Specifically whether it is beginning the process of deciding what commercial aircraft is next on its agenda. Joining me is FlightGlobal Aerospace Managing Editor Jon Hemmerdinger in the USA.
Good morning, Dom. Nice to be here.
So the background to this is the Wall Street Journal on 29th September reported that Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg in February met in the UK with Rolls-Royce officials to discuss a new engine for the airframer's next single-aisle jet, a successor to the 737 MAX, and that it is also working on a new flight deck for that aircraft. Those developments, at least according to the journal, indicate that Boeing has switched strategy, moving on from its primary goal of recovering from production and quality issues to become more future-focused. The article caused a stir among financial analysts, many of whom had supported Boeing's goal of fixing its troubles before spending big on its next aircraft. The company's stock slipped 4% following the report. If nothing else, it has created confusion, at least from the outside. No one is really clear where Boeing's priorities lie. Jon, you've covered Boeing's development efforts for years. What's it previously said about its plans for its next narrow-body aircraft?
Yeah, Dom, Boeing has sort of long been talking about working on its next jet. And the closest that they came to actually launching something beyond the 737 appeared to be about 5 years ago, around 2020. And in the years leading up to then, they had talked about something that they called the new mid-market aircraft, which interestingly was going to be more of a 757 replacement. And this was something that would carry 250, maybe 270 passengers, something like 4,000 nautical miles of range. And that seemed to be on the front burner for Boeing. And it's the same market that Airbus actually tapped with the A321neo. And at the same time, they also knew that they needed to do a 737 replacement, but exactly when that was coming, we didn't know. And maybe the new mid-market aircraft, the NMA it was called, maybe that could be sort of a 737 replacement, partly. It wasn't exactly clear, but the point is Boeing pulled the plug on that NMA in 2020 under former CEO David Calhoun. And we all know Boeing at that point was going through the 737 MAX crisis, so they couldn't focus on that at that point.
What happened then after Boeing cancelled the NMA?
Yeah, what they did was they said they're going to focus entirely on their recovery. The 737 MAX was grounded, production had stopped, and the COVID-19 pandemic was bearing down on the entire industry. So Boeing said, okay, we're not going to do the NMA right now. We're going to focus on a recovery. And then Boeing's situation actually got much worse. Quality problems started to crop up more with the 737 MAX and with the 767, the freighter, and also maybe even the high-profile issues involving the 787 and gaps in the 787's fuselage. So all these issues, quality issues, 737 MAX grounding, COVID-19 pandemic, all came down on Boeing, and they pretty much shut down any serious talk of a next aircraft. Now, all along, they've said that they're sort of working on one in the background, but they are going to focus on their recovery. They were going to focus on fixing their finances, fixing their quality, getting on a better relationship with the FAA, getting long-delayed programs certified, and 737 MAX 7 and MAX 10 and the 777-9 are those still aren't certified. Financial analysts specifically liked that plan because it meant Boeing was going to fix their finances before moving on. And other people said Boeing didn't really have a strategy and it needed to focus more on the future. But that's been Boeing's sort of public position.
And so was that pretty much Boeing's response to the article as well? Very much that continued emphasis on righting its problems and ramping production and so on and so forth.
Exactly. As you mentioned, the Wall Street Journal reported that CEO Ortberg met with Rolls-Royce and that this sort of indicated Boeing was moving quicker or focusing more attention than previously on its next aircraft. And Boeing, in response to that article, specifically reiterated their previous strategy. They said that they are focused on certifications and they're focused on recovery. They're focused on ramping production and getting their finances, getting all this stuff in order. They said that's their primary focus. At the same time, they also said, and this is a quote, Boeing said, as we have done over the decades, our team evaluates the market, advances key technologies, and improves our financial performance so that we will be ready when the time is right to move forward with a new product, end quote. What Boeing was saying was sort of, yes, we're working on something, but we're always working on something. And our strategy of fixing our problems first has not changed.
But didn't Boeing go as far as to say that the Wall Street Journal story was misleading?
That's right. So although Boeing had that public statement that really didn't say too much, it just reiterated that they're kind of going on their previous strategy. There was an internal Boeing communication the following day, and this was it was September 30th. Boeing had an internal communication. Then FlightGlobal reported on this, and Boeing cited the misleading Wall Street Journal article. And Boeing did not elaborate. That was an internal message on Boeing News Network, so it went out to all Boeing employees. The Boeing internal article, the memo to employees, didn't really elaborate on why Boeing thought the Wall Street Journal story was misleading, but it did use that word. And meanwhile, there were several financial analysts also on the 30th of September who also agreed that the Wall Street Journal article was misleading. So there is this question about, is Boeing moving quicker or is it not? And it's kind of an open question.
Yeah, it's not entirely clear how misleading it was. And I'm sure Boeing, just like Airbus, is looking at the technologies it needs to for whatever comes after the 737 MAX.
Yeah, so Boeing is making the point that, of course, we're working on our next technology. We're working on what's next. We're working on the next jet. We're evaluating engines. They didn't say this, but they were talking with Rolls-Royce. They're obviously talking with Pratt & Whitney and with CFM also. Meanwhile, they are working on a somewhat public program with NASA to develop the long and thin wings that they have said will probably be on their next jet. The point is that, of course, Boeing's working on all this stuff, and they have been for years, and they have been since they've been in business, and they need to, because eventually they're going to have to launch a new aircraft, and they have to know what's ready when they do that. So they're talking to all these industry partners and putting together a plan. But they were doing that last year, and they were doing that the year before, and they were doing that when they canceled or paused the NMA in 2020. So it appears that Boeing may not actually be moving any quicker. It's just sort of continuing along the same path. And they will launch their next aircraft when they think the time is right. And in that regard, if that's true, then perhaps there was some bits that were a little bit misrepresentative of what Boeing was doing, and that it really hasn't switched tacks, and it's continuing on this wait and see, evaluate stage.
Is there any consensus yet on what that new jet, when it comes, as it must, I suppose, what that new jet will look like, or what technologies it will feature, or are we too early in this cycle?
Well, no one really knows, because Boeing hasn't said anything, and Boeing can change its mind. But there are people who are close to Boeing who think that the company is going to first launch something like the NMA, revive that. And maybe it's the same design as they had talked about in 2020. This would be a 757 replacement. It would go squarely against and probably best in terms of performance the A321neo. I mean, it would have to be better to get orders. And that's a slice of the market that could maybe also lend itself to a cargo configuration, replacing something like the 767 freighter. It's a market that airlines really do need. The 757s, the U.S. airlines are still flying dozens of 757s, and those jets are, I'm guessing 30 years old, and they badly need new aircraft, and the A321 can do much of that mission, but maybe not quite all of it. So there's generally this thinking that it's going to be an NMA first. probably conventional aircraft in terms of fuselage, probably aluminum fuselage. Maybe you could get composite wings. You would get a new engine, certainly. And I do want to talk to you about that in a minute. And then after that, or sort of concurrent to that NMA, would come the 737 MAX or the 737 direct replacement, which would presumably be slightly smaller than the NMA. And whether or not the NMA and the 737 MAX replacement could somehow be the same line of aircraft is an open question, maybe different sizes. So we don't know exactly what's going on. There is a general thought that it's going to come around to market around the mid 2030s, if not later, which would put us into an aircraft launch in the next couple of years. The other thing that some analysts have noted is that Boeing's backlog for the 737 MAX is sold out through the early 2030s. And Boeing is continuing to take more orders for 737s, and they've been getting lots of orders lately, which is pushing that backlog even farther into the 2030s. They say that because if Boeing were to launch a 737 replacement sooner than had been expected, they could potentially cannibalize 737 sales. And they need to keep that line going as long as they can financially in order to help improve their financial situation. Dom, I think you're pretty well placed to talk about some of the engine facets that are going on, or some of the engine technology. They were talking about either the NMA coming next, or the direct 737 MAX replacement, or for both of those. Boeing has said that they need a significantly more efficient engine. Of course, Airbus wants the same thing. Boeing's talking about 10%, 15% efficiency out of an engine. The Wall Street Journal reported that Boeing was talking with Rolls-Royce. Presumably, there's three engine options in the mix, and you've been covering Rolls-Royce for a little bit. What are they working on?
So the picture with Rolls-Royce is interesting because they have this demonstrator engine they developed called UltraFan, and although the engine they built and ran a couple of years back was scaled for a wide body, so 80,000 pounds force of thrust, or slightly above that. They've always argued that it's scalable. So they can do a wide body engine, they can do a narrow body engine, it can go up, it can go down. And Rolls-Royce are desperate to get back into the narrow body market because ever since they sold out of International Aero Engines in 2012, they've missed out on this boom that's been happening. They could have gone with Pratt & Whitney on the GTF, but opted not to concentrate on wide body, and have, to some extent, missed the riches that Pratt has been bringing in, notwithstanding its own issues. So they want to get back into that market. And they're very much promoting UltraFan as that solution. We found out earlier this year, it's now called the UltraFan 30 for the narrow body segment. And Rolls and a wider consortium are going to at least ground test this narrow body engine within the EU's Clean Aviation initiative. They hope then to take it to flight test towards the end of the decade. And that will give a good indication as to whether that technology, which is a geared fan essentially, could make it onto the next narrow body. Now, the analysts are probably right that Boeing won't launch a 737 MAX replacement with Rolls-Royce as the sole engine provider to replace CFM as the current sole engine provider. But that's not to do with the performance it can get out of that engine. Indications are that it will perform as well as the offerings from Pratt & Whitney and from CFM, but it's probably more to do with industrial capacity. Rolls doesn't have the track record that the other two manufacturers have at the moment for addressing that narrow body market and the sheer volumes you need to turn out on a monthly basis. Now, Rolls has consistently said that it wants a partnership to bring the UltraFan to market for the narrow body segment. And you have to say that the most logical choice would be to go back with Pratt & Whitney in International Aero Engines. Yeah. Pratt has its own issues too, so perhaps adding a credible partner like Rolls-Royce might make sense. In the meantime, of course, you've got CFM developing the open rotor concept through RISE. And that, as Airbus and probably Boeing would tell you, it looks promising from a fuel burn reduction perspective. But at the moment, it is It's just promise, it's just claim. Until that engine is flown, tested and validated, we won't actually know for sure what it can deliver. And there are a bunch of integration headaches, shielding on the side of the aircraft, for instance, that need to be solved in a way that the propulsive efficiency gains aren't swallowed up by the weight and drag penalties that would come about from certain solutions to those problems.
Right.
But then it creates an interesting dilemma for Boeing and Airbus. If they offer an open rotor design, then there's little chance they can or will offer a ducted fan alternative as an option. Airbus has often said that it wants a choice of engines on its platform. But if you're offering an open fan, you can't then offer a ducted fan as well because the installation is too different.
Along those lines, something that I've heard from GE, of course, the CFM partner, is that they are developing all these technologies for the open fan and hybrid electric, compact core, advanced aerodynamics. They're working on all this stuff. And I asked them earlier this year, if the open fan, the open rotor is not the future engine, if airlines or rather manufacturers don't sign on to it and don't order it, what will they do? And they didn't directly answer, but they did say something along the lines of, well, this technology would work on other types of engines or other architectures, which I read to be code for, well, we certainly can put some of this in a traditional ducted fan, which would mean GE, CFM, Safran, they are leaving their options open for what the next engine will be. And if they need to switch, they probably could.
Well, thanks, Jon, for joining me on this episode of Flight Global Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dom. We will have more news about Boeing in the coming weeks, and Boeing's third quarter earnings call is about 2 weeks from now, so probably lots more news coming that day and afterwards.
Flight Global Focus is a production of Flight Global with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments or suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com. And more information can be found in the show notes. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.